A personal crisis is no fun, but you already know that. What makes it a personal crisis, though, is something about you and the way you were operating at the time. And if you had been doing things differently, the crisis likely would have been avoided. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? The point here isn't to point fingers and blame, rather to notice our own unwitting and unknown role in our own personal crises. St. Paul has a personal crisis in our second reading today in which he unwittingly and unknowingly played a role. Now I remember some unpleasant crisis that I went through, and in the moment I was certainly disoriented, wondering what's going on, why is this happening to me? I felt very set up, you know what I mean? I felt duped and tricked, preyed upon. I felt trapped in my old way of dealing with things wasn't helping. I was stuck and had to ride out the storm ill-prepared. St. Paul finds himself in the middle of his own crisis, right? We just mentioned that. He's on his way from Jerusalem to Damascus, a trip of, maybe 150, 200 miles. In fact, this story is so famous, it's become an idiom, a Damascus Road experience. And just before Paul, while he's still Saul in the story, arrives, in verses 3 to 5, we hear, suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And then verses 8 and 9 add, Saul rose from the ground. Although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. As we might say today, he's rather up a creek without a paddle. Now, what's the origin of Paul's crisis? In Galatians chapter 1, in fact, we heard this on Wednesday, written maybe 15 years after this event, Paul says about himself, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. Zealous, that's what he calls himself, right? Full of fervent partisanship and intense emotion, compelling action, energetic and unflagging pursuit of an aim or devotion to a cause. To borrow from a favorite movie of mine, oh man, Saul's thinking about the case had become very uptight. Now, nothing was going to stand in the way of Saul and his vision for Jewish faithfulness, especially some new sect of weirdos of Jews called the Way, who followed some heretical rabbi named Jesus. In Acts 8, we're told that Paul is present at and approves of the lynching, the murder of St. Stephen. And as we already heard today in verses 1 and 2, but Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the Way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Saul has built this up so much in himself that his very existence is now identified with the extermination of these blasphemers claiming belief in a so-called Son of God raised from the dead. Now, as a quick aside, this is exactly what Jesus warned his disciples was going to happen. John 16, right, he says, they will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he's offering service to God. And they will do these things because they have not known the Father nor me. That's what Jesus says. Now, the great irony in all this is that Saul is entirely unaware that this is not working for him. See, any resistance he's encountered before, he just overcame. And not to mention, he's also a pawn in the chief priest's own machinations for power, but that's a different problem. Or as my dad used to say, he's cruising for a bruising, right? Or even the life you save may be your own, right? So you heard that too growing up, right? Saul can't imagine that he and his methods will encounter any serious, meaningful resistance that will require a recalibration of tactics. From a certain perspective, Saul's crisis is self-made. And that's tough to hear, isn't it? that Paul's crisis is self-made, at least from one perspective. In fact, thinking back to my own crisis I mentioned earlier, at the time I was unable to recognize that I had caused my own problem. We should tread carefully here. We're not looking to blame the victim. On the one hand, the people I was dealing with there, they were jerks. But on the other hand, I was the one who unwittingly picked the fight. And that is to say that my crisis happened because of my action. And by the way, to my fellow perfectionists out there, no, you cannot manage your life so perfectly that you avoid all or even most or perhaps any particular crisis or crises. The world just has too much entropy. Anyway, take my actions away, and the crisis would not have come to me. And that doesn't absolve others of their roles in our crisis. It's a dispassionate, distance view that lets me see my role in my life and my crisis. As the old Confiteor prayer of confession says, right? Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. By my fault, by my own fault, by my own most grievous fault. But I couldn't say that at the time. See, I was clueless, and I had some cactus hugging of my own to do. Now, St. Paul sees everything so clearly from his own perspective. Right? He's even got buy-in from the others. Remember, he's been deputized by the chief priest. And even though Paul's charging ahead, convinced and self-assured he's doing the right thing, he can't see the collision he's headed dead for. Saul doesn't know what he doesn't know. But it's too late already. The collision, the confrontation has happened, and now St. Paul must deal with the consequences. See, immediately he's struck blind. It's reminiscent of John chapter 9 when Jesus heals the man born blind. At the end of the episode he says, For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And now Paul has a full-blown crisis on his hands. His own zealousness, his emotionally compelled action caused it for him. As Jesus said in John 16:3, they will do these things because they have not known me or the Father. Now what? Well, now Paul has come face to face with this ugly part of his soul. And ironically, the man who would bind and lead people out of Damascus must be led by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he neither eats nor drinks in his blindness. And he has nothing to say for the rest of the chapter, or for the rest of this section. Now I suppose if God simply wanted to punish St. Paul, he could have just zapped him dead on the spot. But listen to what God says about him in verse 14. He's a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name. God's going to restore Saul into a life of new meaning and purpose. But it won't go as quickly as he might wish. He still has to hug his cactus. And listen to what Ananias says in verse 13. Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much evil he's done to your saints at Jerusalem. It's going to be a while before Paul loses this reputation. In Galatians, Paul notes that it was 3 years before the news about him changed from what Ananias says to he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. That's kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? Hug your cactus. It's the third time we've said it, right? It comes, if you were here on Ash Wednesday, you heard me tell you, it comes from the famous actor Mel Gibson, of all people. And my friend, Pastor Chris, you can go to his website, hugyourcactus.org. It's on your purple sheet for the background story of all that. But that's our theme here for Lent all the way through Maundy Thursday. But here's a summary of what's going on when we say hug your cactus from Pastor Chris. To hug your cactus means, for us, when one's life is not working due to a self-imposed crisis, embrace the ugly part of your soul long enough to become a person of humility and for life to take on new meaning. Embracing means both loving this part of self, or it's not going away, and yet seeking to rein it in and limit its damage. St. Paul's crisis was driven by his own admitted zealousness, which led to his violence against Jesus and the church. He had to come to grips with himself for 3 years, it seems, to take on this new meaning in humility. Too often, when we encounter a crisis, we think, God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you ruining everything I had so carefully planned out? I was doing just fine until you let this happen. And then we think everything is lost and ruined, and we think we cannot start again this way now that this thing has happened. Like Saul, we cannot see, and we cannot eat, and we have nothing to say. And by the way, I'm not here this morning to give you some platitude about all crisis being created equal or something, right? It'll all work out in the end, or everything happens for a reason. Every cloud has a silver lining, or God may close a door but open a window or whatever. And by the way, I've never understood that last one, right? Does he open the window just so you can jump out in your despair? But you don't have to live very long on this earth before having something happen to you that you live to tell about, and you're just fine now, but you still would rather have not gone through it, okay? Anyway, when God enters our crises, they change, and so do we. It's not only by his grace and mercy that we survive them. Yes, of course, we do that, but he's got more in store for us. When God comes in, he begins to show us the error of our ways. That is, he lets us see what we couldn't see before, how our own choices, decisions moved us down the line inescapably, unstoppably toward the crisis event. He lets us glimpse the ugly part of ourselves, right? The prickly part that we avoid. And yet he's still not done with us. See, once he shows us our fault, our ugly part, well, first he offers us his forgiveness, right? Here what happened to St. Paul. He got baptized, right? Ananias came, laid hands on him. Paul jumped up, got baptized. But then God begins the slow process of restoring us to life with new meaning and purpose. It's a crock pot, not a microwave. Paul goes off for 3 years to rebuild, repurposing and retooling his zeal, but using it now for God's purposes. See, God's in this for the long haul with us, not only for the few minutes of the crisis. He wants his new meaning and purpose for us to last for the rest of our lives. Like St. Paul, we're his chosen instruments by his grace through faith to show and tell our own little slice of the world that Jesus is Lord. Amen.